My husband and I, which sounds like either the Queen of England or a very political speech at the Oscars, but my husband and I bought a beautiful little house in Hopetown a few years ago. And there are a lot of beautiful places in the world, but I think with Hopetown, it's not just because it's a beautiful place, but there are so many wonderful, interesting, engaging people, and I think that's what draws us all here. So, I'm not singing tonight, but I'm going to tell you a little story about meeting Adelaide. So we bought our little house. You meet a lot of people who say, oh, how long you were here before you bought a house? We spent 8 cumulative days before we bought a house. Well, we were in Marsh Harbor, and we saw an ad in the realtor's office, Sabore's, Carrie. And we saw this beautiful little house, so we rented a boat and stopped at Firefly for lunch, which was really excellent. And I said to Chris, maybe you should use the stern line. He said, no, we don't have to use the stern line. So we damaged the boat a bit, so it was a very expensive lunch. But we went to see this little house on the beach, and it was so tiny and so tumbled down and so expensive that we just laughed. For a year, we laughed. And then one day we both woke up and said, well, you know, if we did this and did this and did this, and so we bought the little tumbled down house. The Gallup house across from the school, little pink dolphin. My other half said, do we have to be that creepy old gay couple who bought the pink dolphin? I said, that's who we are. And funnily enough, we've been together 35 years, but funnily enough, today is the 10th anniversary of when we were legally married, so we've been legally married. I digress, but it won't be the first time. But there's so many wonderful people in Hopetown, from Davis, the telephone repair guy, who I see a lot, to Miss Candy, to Justin, and just all the people I meet here. I think for a lot of people, Hopetown is sort of the magical, mystical hometown that you never had, and you become part of the community. And I met my neighbor down the beach, Sally Goodrich, and right away I liked her because she reminded me of my aunt in Boston, because my mother's mother was from Boston. And I would visit Sally next door, and sometimes I would make her dinner because I would, you know, smuggle in pork tenderloins that were only $1.99 a pound. And Sally Goodrich could make a piece of pork last for 3 dinners. And I asked her about her house, and she said, well, my father built this house in 1959 for my stepmother Adelaide, who terrified me. She still terrifies me, and she's 104 years old. She would come to my house for a drink, and I'd have a cocktail, and she'd say, oh, I like these glasses, and you know they would end up in her pocketbook before the night was through. But Sally would tell me stories about her stepmother, Adelaide, and I was intrigued. And I just felt bad because I came to Hopetown just after Adelaide, who was the doyenne of Hopetown society, stopped visiting. And I just got this idea in my head that I had to meet Adelaide. So it wasn't going to happen because she wasn't coming down much longer because she's 104. But last month, Chris and I were going to Canada for Canadian Thanksgiving to see my dad and my wicked stepmother, who isn't wicked at all, who's one of my favorite people in the world. And I contacted Sally's son, Chuck, to see if I could meet Adelaide. And at first they said, no, she's old and she knows enough people and blah, 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 blah. But I was a little pushy, and I just sort of said, I want to meet Adelaide. I'm in Hopetown. I've heard so many stories about Adelaide. I want to meet Adelaide. So finally, last month, the day before we were leaving to Canada, I get an email from Chuck saying, it's been approved by the ladies. You can meet Adelaide. So Chris and I get up early in the morning. We live in New York State, a couple hours north of Manhattan. And we drove. We took a couple wrong turns in Rhode Island, but we got to Monument Beach, Massachusetts, and met Sally for lunch at the Lobster Trap. And we lunched on oysters and fried clams and scallops. And Sally had the leftovers put in a little box. She said, this will last me for 3 days. And then we went to see Sally's cottage, which is very nice, and we got to see her photo albums, and her father, who used to come to Hopetown, and his beautiful sailboat. But finally, I got to go to West Falmouth and meet Adelaide. She's still at 104, lives in her own home on the water. She has this vivacious, attractive caregiver who's originally from St. Kitts, who deserves a show about her. She's sort of a Eurasian Eartha Kitt, if you're old enough to get that reference, but very vivacious. But finally, we went into the living room, and I was introduced to Adelaide, and Chuck, when I said I wanted to meet her, said, you can meet her for 5 minutes, but she's very old and tired. Adelaide and I chatted for 2 solid hours at each other, back and forth. And we were talking about poetry, because she's been writing poetry since she was tiny, and she's published books of poetry, and I also happened to write poetry when I was younger. And we were talking about different poets, and at one point she was talking about, in her day, people, it was before the internet, and before television, and before the movies, and before radio even, people would memorize poetry and recite it. And we were chatting, and she was talking about Edgar Allan Poe. And I said, I know him a little bit, and people mostly remember him from his sort of scary short stories, but she said, you know, he wrote some haunting verses as well. And Adelaide said, oh, I wish I could hear Annabel Lee again. Well, coincidentally, when I was a teenager, I had memorized Annabel Lee, and I wouldn't normally say it, but even though it was written for a small, cold New England town, it could have been Hopetown. So this is what I recited to Adelaide. It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived, whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child, and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea. But we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee. With a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. Yes, that was the reason that long ago, in this kingdom by the sea, the wind blew out of a cloud one night, chilling my Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me, to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me, and that is the reason, as all men know, in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind blew out of a cloud one night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we. And neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea, can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And the stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so, all the night tide, I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea. Anyway, so Adelaide was luckier than you because she's the 104, so I only did half of it. So Adelaide and I were chatting back and forth, blah, blah, blah. I was so happy to meet her. We're talking about this and that. And at one point, she asked me about traveling because she was a journalist and traveled a lot. And I was going to France. No, sorry. I was going to Lisbon. This is last month, you think I remember. I was going to Lisbon to meet some French friends. And she said, oh, you speak French? And I said, yes. She said, well, how did you speak French? And my story of speaking French was, even though I'm Canadian, where you learn French at school, it's sort of like in the States where you learn Spanish, but you don't really learn to speak it. But I took private lessons from an elderly woman. And on Saturdays, when my brothers were playing hockey, I went to Miss Kathleen James' apartment. And she was an elderly Canadian woman, but she had lived in Paris, and she spoke French beautifully. And her clothes were worn, but of really good quality, beautifully laundered and pressed. Her hair was done up in a vaguely Edwardian, Katharine Hepburn sort of hairdo, and her high-collared blouses were gossamer thin. And I would sit in her tiny apartment in her beautiful, it was a beautiful neighborhood, and we would drink hot chocolate, eat bonbons, read Perry Match magazine, and discuss the news of the day in French. All, it seemed, in preparation to meet Adelaide in West Falmouth, who chatted with me in French, and I, in turn, was surprised at how well she spoke French. And Adelaide said, well, my first language was French. She was from Tennessee. My father came back from the war. We're talking the Great War, World War I. My father came back from the war, and he had collected this elderly French woman who had lost her entire family in the war. So she moved to Tennessee and became our governess. So Mademoiselle, we called her Mademoiselle, Mademoiselle refused to speak English. So we learned French because we were children and our brains are sponge-like and we learn things quickly. But the other servants had a hard time having to learn French, but they had to because she refused to speak a word of English. So Mademoiselle was with us for several years, but eventually she decided she was really elderly and she was going back to France to die. And in those days, elderly was like 60 years old. So my father decided to make a family trip of it, so we went to Paris, and I went to school in Paris. And one night, my brother, my twin brother, who was an avid Boy Scout, he said, I'm going on some excursion. And I wasn't interested in Boy Scouts, and I said no, but he pestered me, so finally I said yes. And we drove north of Paris, and there was this big empty field, and at one end there was a crowd of people, but whoever was looking after us didn't want us to get lost in the crowd, so we sat at the other end, and we were standing there when Charles Lindbergh landed his first transatlantic flight 10 feet away from me. And he was so handsome with his blonde hair, and he had a cleft in his chin, and he uncurled his long legs from that airplane, and the second his toe touched the ground, he became the most famous man on the planet. That was the first story I heard from Adelaide, so I was hooked. She gave me a book of her poetry that she published on her 100th birthday, called Swan Song. And I've been traveling a lot since then, but I did happen to open in the middle, and she wrote a poem for Hopetown, and it went like this. How dear this place has been to me for more than half a century, but I've got sense enough to see that though for me no bonds are stronger, these visits may not go on much longer. A thought that brought me desolation until I found this consolation. If memories of us still persist, who's to say we don't exist? And so I know I won't depart if you still hold me in your heart. And here's a thought to take for granted. Inside mine, you're firmly planted. Anyway, so that was Adelaide. And I'm sure I've gone over my 6 minutes, so I'll just finish up that the visit went really well. We talked. We got along spectacularly. It went on far too long, but we got along really well. It wasn't until Chris and Sally were getting a little afternoon drowsiness that Adelaide and I stopped talking. But when I get home, I sent her a poem to thank her, because that's our common language, verse. And I won't give you the whole thing, but I will just finish with the last little bit of the poem I sent to Adelaide. My mission was accomplished and introductions made. 5 minutes turned to hours with the lovely Adelaide. So I say to all who hear it, I have met a kindred spirit. Though apart by generations, she exceeded expectations. We recited, we recounted, we parlayed, we reminisced. I savored every moment. I'm so glad it wasn't missed. And Adelaide, once was not enough. So until we meet again. Anyway.
Ritchie, ladies and gentlemen, give a round of applause for